Good afternoon. This is the fifth lecture for the second test period of History 2303. And today what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the coming of the American Civil War. A period of time is very distressful in the history of Texas. When the Texas Convention in March 5th of 1861 asked for admission into the Confederacy, the diehard Calhoun Democrats of Texas and the other Deep South states literally had, before the election of November 1860, proclaimed that if Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, a Republican, that the southern states would secede from the Union. And indeed, Texans were not long in March of 1861 of leaving the Union and declaring allegiance to the Confederate States of America. When that occurred, all state officials were requested to take an immediate oath of allegiance to the Confederate States of America. Sam Houston was the governor of Texas in 1861, and Houston refused. 3 times the convention, the secessionist convention, called his name. Sam Houston, come and take the office come and take the oath of allegiance to the Confederate States of America. And Governor Houston sat in the basement of the Capitol with the legislature meeting on the ground floor and sat whittling a piece of wood as the convention called his name 3 times. At that point, the convention declared that Sam Houston had vacated the office of governor, and Lieutenant Governor Edward Clark took the oath of office as the first Confederate governor of Texas. Again, Edward Clark. The truth is that new President Abraham Lincoln had offered to aid Governor Houston if he would oppose the convention, the secessionist convention in Texas, and use force against it. But Houston rejected the proposal, unwilling to initiate a civil war in Texas. Sam Houston didn't want to see the nation, the state, first the nation and then the state that he brought into existence by winning the Battle of San Jacinto, literally come apart in a civil war. And so on March the 23rd of 1861, the Constitution of the Confederate States of America was ratified, and on March the 26th, the Texas State Secessionist Convention adjourned. As the Texas Secessionist Convention acted, there were 2,700 federal troops in Texas, and they were stationed at San Antonio, Texas, under the leadership of United States General D.E. Twiggs. D.E. Twiggs. Twiggs was a Southerner. He was from Georgia, and he had pro-slavery sympathies for the Southern cause. But despite the fact he was a Southerner, he was an officer in the United States military. And multiple times during the secessionist convention, General Twiggs instructed, or at least wrote his superiors in Washington, D.C. at the War Department in Washington, what he should do if Texas seceded from the Union. When the War Department did not respond to D.W. Twiggs, he submitted his resignation. However, before he could relinquish his command of the 2,700 U.S. troops in Texas, and that was, by the way, 20% of the entire American Army was stationed in Texas at the point of the Civil War. And that says something about how incredibly hostile the Indians of Texas were, that the United States government had to have 20% of its entire armed forces of its army stationed in Texas. Before Twiggs could relinquish command, however, the Texas Confederate Committee on Public Safety, they had a committee called the Committee on Public Safety, demanded the surrender of Twiggs' command, his troops, and all of the federal equipment that he had with him. Twiggs agreed on February the 18th, 1861, to evacuate all Union fortifications in Texas and leave Texas, provided that his troops could retain their arms and camp equipment and transport. And all of his arms would be delivered to his troops when they arrived at their ports of embarkation along the Texas coast. However, Texas Ranger and Confederate Henry McCullough decided that that was not good enough, and he accepted the Union surrender of northern fortifications in Texas, and Confederate Colonel Rip Ford, the former Texas Ranger, the fortifications in South Texas belonging to the Union troops. So without a shot fired in anger, 20% of the entire United States Army that was stationed in Texas surrendered, along with their military supplies and property valued at $3 million. It was a tremendous loss of supplies and equipment and manpower when 20% of the American Army surrendered in Texas. April the 12th, 1861, witnessed the fighting at Fort Sumter, inaugurating the American Civil War. During the American Civil War, 135 Confederate officers above the rank of lieutenant colonel were Texans. Among these was one of the original full five-star generals of the Confederacy, Albert Sidney Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston was so highly regarded in the United States Army that he was commissioned before Robert E. Lee was commissioned a five-star general of the Confederacy. There was Albert Sidney Johnston. There was John Bell Hood, who was a lieutenant general. There were 3 major generals: Samuel Maxey, John Wharton, and Tom Green, 32 brigadier generals, and 98 colonels. So Texas had 135 significant officers that served the Confederacy during the context of the Civil War. Texas expended $3.5 million of state funds within Texas for military purposes, and Texans paid $37 million in Confederate notes to the Confederate government during the Civil War. Protecting Texas against the Yankee invaders was an immediate concern. Resolved in May of 1861, that was partially resolved when W.C. Young, former sheriff of Cook County in North Texas, led Confederate volunteers, cavalry particularly, across the Red River and seized United States forts Arbuckle, Cobb, and Washita in the Oklahoma Territory without a shot being fired. Indian defense until December of 1863 in Texas was in the hands of the Texas Confederate Frontier Regiment, which maintained 16 Army outposts, including Camp Verde up the road from Kerrville. Those 16 outposts were spread from the Red River to the Rio Grande. In December of 1863, the Frontier Regiment was transferred to Confederate service, but defense on the frontier continued to rely heavily on state militia troops. In the northern area of Texas, Texas Confederate Governor Pendleton Murray, M-U-R-R-A-H, Pendleton Murray, appointed James Throckmorton as a Confederate Brigadier General. Remember, Throckmorton had opposed secession. He was one of those who voted against secession in the secessionist convention and was booed for it. Throckmorton was placed in command, and he served Texas well during the Civil War in Texas. From 1863 to 1865, deserters also confused life on the Texas frontier. And there was one interesting Indian battle during the Civil War. In January of 1864, at Dove Creek outside of San Angelo, 370 Confederate state troopers attacked 1,400 Kickapoo Indians who were migrating from Oklahoma to Mexico. The Confederates thought that these were hostile Indians, and they attacked the Kickapoo. The Kickapoo were basically peaceful Indians who were migrating to Mexico. But when the Confederates attacked them, the Kickapoo responded, and Confederate state troops took heavy losses in the Battle of Dove Creek. The most significant early military campaign for Confederate Texas, was an attempt to occupy the New Mexico Territory. Colonel John Baylor, Confederate Colonel John Baylor, led Texas troops into the New Mexico Territory, and in August of 1861 he issued a proclamation establishing the Confederate Territory of Arizona. The Confederate Territory of Arizona. They didn't perceive New Mexico as New Mexico. It was New Mexico was just sort of a eastern section of what was called the Arizona Territory. The Arizona Territory comprised parts of New Mexico south of the 34th parallel. Confederates for a while occupied land as far west as Tucson, Arizona, in their desire to expand the Southern Confederacy, perhaps even to the Pacific Ocean. Simultaneously, Confederate General H. Sibley, Sibley, with 3 regiments, about 4,000 troops of Confederate Texans, attempted to expel the Federals from the New Mexico Territory, the northern New Mexico Territory. General Sibley and his Confederates attacked and defeated well over 3,800 Union troops at Val Verde, New Mexico, in February of 1862, and the Confederates triumphantly entered Santa Fe and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Yet, in March the 28th of 1862, at Glorieta Pass, the Federals checked Sibley's advance, and a bunch of Colorado miners working for the Union crossed the mountains to the rear of Sibley's command and burned his supply train. Sibley retreated from New Mexico, and without supplies, his Confederates straggled back to San Antonio during the vicious summer of 1862. His command spread out 50 miles by the time the first of his command straggled back into San Antonio. The Union troops didn't pursue Sibley, since several hundred Confederates would die of hunger and a lack of water on his return trip to San Antonio. Texas coastal defenses were much more successful during the Civil War. The Federals attempted invasions, but little progress was made. However, in October of 1862, the Federals attacked Galveston. The Federal Navy, the Union Navy, sailed up to Galveston, and the outmanned Confederates withdrew from the mainland, from the island of Galveston, without virtually a shot fired. 2 months later, the Confederates sent General John Magruder, who was placed in command of Texas, and Magruder's mission was to recapture Galveston, Texas. 2 steamboats, the Neptune and the Bayou City, were converted into cottonclads, and 300 veterans back from Sibley's disastrous New Mexico campaign served as Marines on these 2 cottonclad ships. And on the night of the last day of 1862 and the morning of New Year's Day, January the 1st, 1863, Confederate forces under John Magruder attacked and retook the island of Galveston. With 26 26 Confederates killed and 117 wounded, but with 414 Union troops killed and captured. The Confederates lost the Confederate cotton-clad Neptune, but two Federal ships, two Union warships, the Harriet Lane and the Westfield, were both destroyed in the Battle of Galveston. And Galveston would remain in Confederate hands until virtually the end of the Civil War. In September of 1863, the Federals made yet a second attempt to invade Texas when 5,000 men, 4 gunboats, and 23 transports organized at New Orleans under United States Admiral David Farragut and United States Army General Nathaniel Banks. And they were to descend on Sabine Pass over in East Texas and land at Sabine Pass and then attempt to take Houston and Galveston by land. Guarding Sabine Pass was one fortification called Fort Griffin, G-R-I-F-F-I-N, Fort Griffin. Fort Griffin had a force of 43 Irish Confederates under the command of Confederate Lieutenant Dick Dowling of Houston, Texas. On September the 6th of 1863, this massive Federal fleet attacked Fort Griffin, but the Confederate artillery disabled 2 Union gunboats, and literally 350 Union soldiers were captured by the Confederates, and the rest of the Federal fleet turned around and sailed back to New Orleans in absolute defeat. During the war, in the entirety of the Civil War, the Confederate national government only on 2 occasions crafted gold medallions to honor the heroes of the Confederacy. And one of those 2 occasions was to honor Dick Dowling and his 43 Irish defenders at Fort Griffin during the Battle of Sabine Pass, again September 1863. A third attempt by the Federals attempted an invasion of the lower Rio Grande Valley, away from the populated areas of the state. In 1862, in November of 1862, Nathaniel Banks, General of the United States, stationed at New Orleans, decided to land with 5,000 to 6,000 Union troops at the mouth of the Rio Grande River and seized the island at the mouth of the Rio Grande River called Brazos de Santiago. From Brazos de Santiago, the Federal troops could easily attack the mainland and seize Brownsville. Over the next 2 months, Banks took Corpus Christi, Aransas Pass, Mustang Island, Indianola, and Lavaca, until only Galveston and Sabine Pass remained in Confederate hands as viable Confederate forces. A fourth attempt to conquer Texas was made in the spring of 1864 from Alexandria, Louisiana. Banks, once again with 25,000 Federal troops and gunboats, moved up the Red River, headed to East Texas, with the intent of invading East Texas. This force was to link up with another Union army of 15,000 men marching southwest from Little Rock, Arkansas. With large numbers of Texans fighting over in the east, in the Eastern Theater with Robert E. Lee and General Hood and others, Joseph Johnston, Confederate General Kirby Smith of Texas commanded the Trans-Mississippi West Department. And Kirby Smith was desperate for any manpower that he could get his hands on. Magruder wanted every available Texas soldier that he could to stop this invasion from Louisiana. With 8,000 Confederates, Confederate General Sterling Price stopped the 15,000 Federals moving from Little Rock, Arkansas at the Battle of Camden, Arkansas, and then Confederate General Richard Taylor, with 11,000 troops, attacked and all but routed Banks at Mansfield, Louisiana, taking 2,500 Union prisoners. Despite repulsing the the Confederates the next day, Banks nevertheless retreated to the east side of the Mississippi River and to safety. And so the fourth attempt to invade Texas by the Union forces during the Civil War fell short. In the summer of 1864, Rip Ford's Confederates in South Texas recaptured Fort Brown and pushed the Federals from the mainland, and only the Federals continued to hold the island at the mouth of the Mississippi, the mouth of the Rio Grande River, called Brazos de Santiago. We know that the last battle of the Civil War was fought in Texas in May the 13th of 1865 at Palmetto Ranch in South Texas, when Ford and 300 Confederates defeated 2 Union black regiments and a company of unmounted Union cavalry. From his 11 Union prisoners, Rip Ford learned, the Confederate commander learned that Robert E. Lee had surrendered 1 month earlier in April of 1865 at Appomattox, and that the war was effectively over. Even after General Joseph Johnston surrendered to William Tecumseh Sherman in April of 1865, Governor Murray, Texas Governor Murray, Confederate General Kirby Smith, and others insisted on continuing the war. And they persisted until Jefferson Davis was arrested in western Georgia on his way to Texas. The great interior of Texas had not been touched by the Yankees, and Davis and many Confederate officials felt that if they could just shift the war effort to Texas, they could continue successfully the Civil War. After attempting to get better terms from Grant than he had gotten from Lee, Confederate General Kirby Smith formally surrendered all Confederate forces in Texas. He surrendered in Galveston on June the 2nd of 1865. And then Kirby Smith and Governor Murray promptly fled to Mexico, pledging never to live under Yankee rule. But the truth is, Magruder and others would eventually come back to the United States of America. By the time that excuse me very much, by the time Union General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston in on June the 19th of 1865, there was complete chaos in Texas. A new president, Andrew Johnson, in May had already granted amnesty to those assisting the Confederates, and in June the 17th, Johnson appointed A.J. Hamilton, a Unionist, Texas Unionist before the Civil War, to be the provisional governor of post-war Texas. But General Granger was in charge until Hamilton arrived, and so Granger's first act on June the 19th of 1865 was to declare all Texas slaves free. Thus, June 19th has been observed as, by Texas blacks, as their Independence Day in Texas, Juneteenth, June 19, 1865. The reality is that the state of Texas was a very lawless place during the Civil War, and it was a painful financial cost to Texas to support the Confederacy, but that was something that Confederates were willing to do. And at this point, I want to cut this off lecture, and we'll come back next time and we'll talk about Confederate life styles during the Civil War, and we'll talk about some opposition to the Confederacy during the Civil War, mainly the Unionists of Central Texas, who were persecuted for being disloyal to the Confederacy during the American Civil Conflict. Have a good day, and I will see you in the clouds.